Okay, well, it is 12:01 Eastern Time. We have people showing up from across North America, and I'm really happy that Shar is here for the second in our series on diversity, equity, and inclusion in public relations in Canada. Last week, you will remember, those who had the chance to be able to listen to Gail Strawn on her her presentation on institutional racism in the Black Lives Matter era or movement. That presentation is up online on our MCM website, so it's available for you to be able to pull that down. These series, the next 8 sessions, will be posted immediately after we edit them. We get the speaker's approval. We won't do the weekly delay like we usually have done, because we believe that the importance of the subject matter is critically to the industry. So without further ado, I'm going to send it over to Shar. Shar is an MCM grad. This is research that she did for her capstone, and she's going to explain how she came upon this journey and why this journey was important. She presented this about 1.5 years ago, and then dutifully decided to take some time off from the research world. And now I've been encouraging her to find ways to communicate the results of her information. In between, she after delivering a capstone, she delivered a very beautiful young baby. So that might have been the reason why her research dissemination or sharing was delayed, but we're glad that you are. And as you just said, perhaps it was waiting for its time, and its time is now, and its time is a really important conversation that we all need to have. Yeah. And these are conversations that we need to listen to. They might not be comfortable for some people, but it's important that we listen and try, if we can, to walk in other people's shoes as they talk about their lived experiences, which are so very important for all of us. You will see on the screen Chuck Wallington. Chuck is the Executive Vice President, Chief Communication Officer of Cone Health in Greensboro, North Carolina. Chuck will be our guest presenter next week to talk about his capstone research that he did in the Syracuse program that mirrors this one that Shar has done on looking and investigating the lived experience of Black women in Ontario. Chuck will talk about the lived experiences of Black male public relations practitioners in the United States. So without further ado, the new president of CONTENTEVENTS, Sharlyn Carrington, to you, MCM as well.
Thank you very much. I really like the new business plug you had there for me. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I'm really happy to be here. I really had to re-delve into this research because, as Terry said, I haven't spoken about it or really, lived it, I guess, since the late 2018. But, today is my 1-year-old daughter's birthday. And today, thank you. Today is also, I think, based on everything we're seeing around us in the news and the things that so many people live every single day, I think this topic is very, very timely. So I'll just jump into it really quickly, and I'll try and share my screen so you can see what I've put together for you. And I think you guys can all see this, right?
Yep.
Good.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, so, this conversation, as I mentioned, is both, really timely, but also really overdue. I mean, we see definitely in the US, but in a Canadian context as well, these incidents constantly of anti-Black racism. And now there's this kind of widespread awakening, or rather acceptance, that there's a problem that no one was really talking about. And, we see organizations commenting in this public forum where they stand on the issue because they know And likely they have a communicator like one of us telling them in their ear that it truly is to their detriment to stay silent. So, you know, there are many opinions as to why all of this, all of a sudden is something that people and organizations are really talking openly about. And, you know, I think in part it's because COVID-19 has for too long kind of taken over the news cycle, right? And completely overtaken all of organizational communications internally and externally. And I'm calling this like the COVID fatigue, right? Another opinion, of course, is that, you know, video and social media has finally made this a conversation that we can no longer ignore, and has really shed light on actions that are no longer justified, right? So now we have these organizations that don't know what to say, and they don't know how to say it. And this is a huge opportunity for communications, but it's also a threat for communications as a profession. And we know communicators are the ones who, you know, we shape what and how an organization communicates. And our goal as communicators, of course, is to do this in a way that positively impacts an organization's reputation. And it becomes hugely problematic if, one, we don't have communicators who know what they're doing, who are part of that community that, you know, they're speaking to, and they don't know what the community is saying. They don't know how to say it to them. And when I say the community, in this case, I mean the Black community. And secondly, it looks really contrived. If all of a sudden we have these organizations kind of touting their one Black employee to be their public spokesperson, for everyone else looking in, it begs the question, you know, why was that person not visible or not a part of the dominant coalition, let's say before? Like, why is that one Black employee only now being given a seat at the table? So this brings me to my capstone study, which, as I mentioned, and as Terry mentioned, I completed in late 2018, but of course it's very, very relevant now. I sought out to study why there seemed to be so few Black female communicators in Canadian PR. And I took a very specific focus in Ontario PR because, you know, simply, one, that's where the Black population is in Canada, and two, it was easier for me to get one-on-one interviews with participants here in Ontario. So at the time, this is in 2018, you know, what I saw happening around us then wasn't as much of a boiling point as it is now. There definitely was this kind of hidden underbelly of racism in Canada that no one wanted to admit was still an issue. You know, Canada itself always has that reputation that we're open, we're tolerant, we're diverse, and everything is kind of blue skies and rainbows. Even anecdotally, I look around kind of at the table I was sitting in at work, or just, you know, at a networking event in PR, and I would be the one that would stick out like a sore thumb. So if I thought about what images I saw in the media of PR professionals, I saw these high-powered, kind of aggressive, well-dressed spin doctor personas, but they were all also white women. And I asked myself, you know, was there actually a lack of diversity and in particular, like a lack of Black women in public relations? And if there was, what's keeping us out of the field? So that is just to give you a bit of an overview. What I'm going to do here today during this talk, I'm going to give you a bit of the context. I'm going to just very briefly go over some of the literature I pulled from for my study, really the kind of things and the kind of information that informed what I did and how I approached what I did and what I asked. Then I'll tell you really quickly about the methodology. I'll tell you what I heard from participants. And then I'll think about, you know, what that means for us now. And of course, some kind of takeaway, what our next steps could be as a profession and as communicators moving forward. So once again, let's look back. Let's look at the then. All of the research I did when I started painted this very clear picture, right? Most of it, of course, was based on US data, which in itself was a huge challenge for, you know, the study of public relations, is that so much of our data comes from the US. There's so little Canadian data available. Regardless, we know based on that US data that women account for more than 2/3 of all practitioners in the US, yet still only make up an average of 6% less than male practitioners. And we also know that PR teams tend to skew towards mostly Caucasian females, although the leadership teams, as I'm sure we've all seen, tend to be largely male. We know that, you know, there are disparities that are even more obvious when it comes to racial and ethnic groups. And many of the studies that I referred to while preparing to do my research actually called PR the last of the lily white professions. which I thought was extremely telling and really informed the way I moved forward with my research. I really was looking very closely for Ontario numbers, Ontario census data. And I actually found that there are 43,360 professionals that work in advertising and in PR in Ontario specifically, but only 5.7% of them were self-identified Black people. And the thing about that is that, you know, they couldn't even narrow that down. We couldn't narrow that down anymore to be able to say of the 5.7%, you know, 2%, 1%, 3% of those people work in public relations specifically as a distinct practice and not, you know, advertising. So that was a bit of a challenge, but I think it still did bring some kind of, it really did inform my research still. Studies conducted in the US also demonstrated that, you know, few Black women are employed in public relations and that the population of practitioners doesn't proportionately reflect the diversity of the country. And I think we see this here in Canada as well. Black women particularly are underrepresented, in senior management and are more likely to hold lower level positions, which is sad. So I'll tell you quickly about the literature I read. I'm not going to delve too deep into it, but I'll tell you very briefly that I looked at, you know, what the meaning of reputation was, and then specifically what the reputation of public relations was, as was conducted by other studies. I looked at the idea of image and perception, because of course we as communicators, you know, we deal in image and perception and persuasion every single day. I looked at gender and racial barriers as well, of course, and what the research said about that. As well as discrimination in the field, what had been studied to date, of course. And I examined kind of the relevant literature about the importance of diversity, which I think we all know coming into this, that, you know, diversity is important, we can all agree. So what did I learn about reputation? I won't define it for you, we all know what it is, but a key takeaway from the literature that I found particularly relevant was that we process information at 3 different levels, right? We process it, 1, based on our personal experience. Secondly, we process it based on what our friends and our colleagues and acquaintances tell us. And then we process reputation based on what we've seen from mass media. None of this is surprising to any of us here, right? There was actually a study that was done on movies and on TV shows over a, I believe, 15-year period. And the study identified this trend where women in PR were portrayed as attractive, as, you know, social, as stylish, and as white. So white skin in North America has historically been perceived as kind of this, you know, prototypical attribute of leaders in business, while Black skin has been the exact opposite. Once again, I won't get into too deeply the idea of image and all the things I studied surrounding image, but I will say that, you know, image is what we see. It's how over time a person or an organization, or in the case of this study, an entire profession becomes known. Image is therefore a collection of qualities and psychological attributes that we've accumulated in our minds over time. And I want you to remember this because it sounds like I'm throwing a lot of information at you, but all of it really does tie together. I looked as well at the research surrounding identity and Blackness in specifically. I won't define identity. Certainly everyone here on this call is a communicator. Certainly, you know, we all deal in organizational identity every single day. But something in the research really did stand out to me, and that was this idea of racial identity. And this idea that racial identity has been linked with several phenomena, right? Particularly when it comes to those who identify as Black. For example, I was researching this notion that there's a lack of self-confidence and other adverse effects that are actually caused by the negative associations linked to actually being Black. So those who do identify as Black have been known to change their behavior based on their surroundings. And this happens all the time in workplaces where, you know, a Black employee may demonstrate a different part of themselves when they're speaking with other Black employees. They may speak differently, dress differently, and wear their hair differently in a different environment, so in a work environment, than they would necessarily when they were out, you know, with their friends or in their own groups. And this is actually referred to as code switching. So you may have heard of the term before, code switching. This is what it means. A 2015 study actually uncovered that as an attempt to avoid being limited by their ethnicity, 80% of Black practitioners admitted that they code switch regularly, like all the time. And this in itself is an identity negotiation, right? It's a form of strategic communication that these Black practitioners are doing above and beyond their jobs, on top of their jobs. So researchers have actually argued that living in this reality of concurrent identities, can actually positively impact the way Black practitioners perform their jobs, right? Because especially when they're creating communications for vast groups of people that may fall within similar identity groups. So let's link all this together, right? We know reputation, perception, image. What do we do with all this information now? If we apply this information, as I did while I was doing my research, we apply this knowledge about what we see and how reputation is formed to public relations. So one we know is formed by personal experience. My personal experience at the time, I was mostly seeing only white women. We know it's formed by what our colleagues and friends tell us. And everyone I spoke to at the time agreed that they mostly saw white women in the field. Actually, when I was looking for participants to reach out to for my study, all of the people I spoke to really could only name me. There were one or two people who could name another Black woman in public relations for me to reach out to. So that was extremely telling in itself. And thirdly, of course, what the media says, and based on the study I shared with all of you, the media is telling us that we're mostly seeing white female practitioners. So if we're mostly seeing the same image, it starts to teach us, and I'm going to actually say the words, it starts to program us to believe that the field is only for one type of person, for white women. If public relations as a practice holds this common existing reputation, image, and identity, it really can greatly impact the way it's valued as a business function. And beyond that, this reputation can actually impact whether it's viewed as a viable field to work in. So of course, I did research on racism. What did we know about racism as a concept, and what do we know about racism in the field itself? So I delved into that literature. I don't think it will surprise any of you about what I found out or what I read. Recent studies indicated that there is a decline in the traditional idea of explicit racism, right? But discrimination is still happening in hire decisions, even unconsciously, even if, hiring managers aren't sitting here thinking, I don't like this person because they're Black. There's still this idea of I connect with this person more because they look like me or they remind me of myself versus the other way around. So these traditional kind of openly racist attitudes that reinforce this idea of inferiority of Black people has evolved, right? It's evolved into this modern, this subtle racism where hiring decisions are masked by, other non-racist reasons not to hire someone. And I think a lot of practitioners mention, and I myself have experienced this as well, this idea of, they're just not the right fit. So therefore, even though there have been lots of advances towards actually ending racial discrimination, we have laws in place to try and end racial discrimination, it's really hard to contradict these kind of deep-rooted ideas of racism that still exist and that hold influence, whether explicitly demonstrated or not. And that's a really important point. Many Black practitioners openly discussed feelings that their careers had been hindered because of their race. And this is research that I didn't do. This is research that other scholars did before my time. IABC, for example, did a study over 30 years ago and reported that 60% of their respondents had experienced race and gender-based barriers in their career. And then, fast forward 25 years later in 2015, young minority practitioners are still pointing to the same challenges in newer studies, which is frankly sad that very little has seemed to change in 30 years. A 2002 study conducted in the US, of course, we mostly only have US data, identified almost 30,000 filed race-based workplace discrimination charges. And more recent studies, more recent than that, have told these stories of microaggressions in the workplace as this kind of consistent and persistent reality of Black practitioners. And also feelings by younger practitioners of color that their employers don't care to create any kind of positive relationship with them because of their race. And it's really sad whether or not they're able to prove that that's true, that they come away having that feeling. So of all of the studies researched, the most common results included practitioners feeling pigeonholed into dealing with accounts where their public or their audience were mostly minorities. They reported feeling instances of stereotyping. They reported having, limited opportunities to advance when compared to their white counterparts. Some of you may be hearing these numbers and these stats and these studies, and you're thinking, why has no one talked about it? Like, why are these Black women and these Black practitioners not making a complaint or not filing a grievance? But the truth is, when Black women have reported incidents in the past of discrimination, they've been seen as overly loud. They've been seen as aggressive. They've been seen as troublemakers. And a lot of people come back with this, actually being told that they're angry and Black, and they get this angry Black name or label placed on them as a result. So these actions really do speak volumes about the nature of diversity in our field, right? If practitioners therefore have felt like they have no recourse in the face of discrimination, this can, and studies have actually shown this can have had an effect on their mental health and their comfort in their role as public relations practitioners. So let's not forget gender barriers. So obviously there are race barriers, but I'm speaking to Black women specifically in this study. And I won't get into it too deeply as well, but I will share some of the key facts. We know women hold over 70% of all PR positions in the US. Once again, we don't have Canadian data, which is sad. There was a 2005 study conducted where more men in the field openly believed and professed that they thought gender discrimination in PR no longer existed. And quite obviously, though female practitioners, especially those of color, disagreed with that idea completely. And they said, they reported earning less than their counterparts. They reported being promoted less frequently, being pigeonholed in lower positions, being given less opportunities. And what I thought was interesting as well is that, in such a recent study, we're still hearing about these challenges of, being able to balance kind of the at-home caregiving family obligations with this constant demand, 24/7, go, go, go of the PR job. So all of this research identified that there still are gender barriers that exist. But of course, other factors like ethnicity and race, where women are placed in the gender power scheme differently, where white women are placed higher than other women of color. And this is where the notion of intersectionality comes in, obviously. We know Black women are more likely to be in a worse situation when it comes to job level, when it comes to income, security, satisfaction, and overall have more barriers that exclude them from getting promoted. And while some Black women talk about feeling invisible compared to their white male counterparts, intersectionality research actually builds on that idea, right? And they profess that there's this dual discrimination experience by Black female practitioners that we've all frankly ignored for too long. Mentorship was another piece that I researched, and it really did also come out in the study that I did, and you'll hear about that a little later. But although discrimination, of course, continues to be a barrier, so too is the lack of role models and mentors. I mean, Black respondents in many of these studies, and as you'll find out in my study as well, talked about having difficulty finding people of color in the field that they can look up to, that they could, reach out to, that they could learn from, and people that they want to create social support groups or other networks with. And the argument has been made, and I think, after hearing the results of my study, you may make the same argument as well, that there could actually be a positive correlation between the lack of mentors and the low retention of Black women in the field. Of course, I had to look at diversity. This is what we're talking about here. Not only diversity, just having Black women in the field, but diversity as a whole in the field. And I think we've heard ad nauseum about the importance of diversity, but really there should be as much diversity inside the organization as there is outside of the organization for the organization itself to be the most effective. When organizations, or in this case, we're talking about an entire profession, so public relations, neglects to really embrace diversity, it can miss huge opportunities. And these opportunities not only to reach diverse publics, but it can also become more vulnerable to possible crises. And we've seen this 100 times before. Like, the media is always reporting on this new mishap where H&M or Coca-Cola or Volkswagen or whatever the company created a product or created an ad that was not culturally sensitive at all. And, you know, it really impacted their bottom line, right? It offended stakeholders, they lost customers, they lost business, they lost, you know, reputational capital as a result, and then they had to come out and apologize about it. So what does all this mean? What did this lead me to? This led me to my 3 research questions, which was, is the reputation of PR a deterrent or a barrier for Black women thinking about entering the practice? To what extent is discrimination a deterrent or a barrier for them? And to what extent is, you know, this lack of representation, this lack of being able to see Black women in the field actually a detriment to the entire profession of public relations? So just tell you a bit about my participants. I interviewed 21 women in communications and public relations. I had one-on-one in-depth interviews with them, some of them lasting an hour, some of them lasting even more than that, really just to delve into the questions and hear a bit more about their experiences. They all worked in a range of fields across all industries, government, manufacturing, you know, agency work, so on and so forth. Many of them were between the ages of 31 to 54. And they mostly held intermediate and middle management positions. I think there were maybe one person who was like a CEO or owned their own business, but generally I think even that was telling. Just finding out at what level some of these women seem to, you know, be pigeonholed in. So what I asked them generally, you know, why they entered the field, what they thought it was when they were first entering the field, what their opinions were of it, and of course how that changed. I asked them whether they thought it was an inclusive profession to be in. I asked them if they had mentors and what those experiences were like. I asked them if they felt satisfied in their careers, you know, if they had barriers when trying to reach their career goals, or, you know, why they were in the level that they were in and if they were happy being there. I asked them if they, you know, if they had experiences of discrimination, whether, you know, racial discrimination or gender discrimination, whatever it was. And I asked them what their in the moment response was. How did they respond? What did they do next? And then I asked them what they thought was deterring Black women from entering PR, right? Like, did they think there were a lot of Black women in PR, and what did they think was keeping us out of it? And then of course we had the diversity conversation. How could diversity actually help our fields, and, you know, what are the steps that we could take to actually better diversity or increase diversity? And let me tell you a bit about what I heard. So when it came to public relations, you know, I asked them about their initial knowledge, what they thought, what their opinions were when they were first entering the field, and they all kind of came out with the same view of what we see in the media, right? Like this glamorous, this high-powered, flashy, spin doctor, agency type, you know, a lot of cattiness within the field because it's a lot of women, supposedly. This idea that there's no work-life balance at all, and it's just go, go, go. And then of course, they all said this idea that it was mostly white women in the field. And I asked them specifically if because of this, it was difficult for them to get into public relations as a field, to get their first public relations job. And, you know, I thought the result there was actually kind of interesting or surprising to me. 50% of them said, yeah, it was really easy. I just, you know, I got an internship and I moved up that way. Or some of them said it was really, really difficult. No one wanted to hire me, even though I had the skills and the education. And then of course I asked them the inclusive question, right? Like, do they think the field is inclusive? 44% flat out said no. It's not inclusive, it's not diverse, no. 22% of them specifically said it's white dominated. There were a few stories of explicit racism that actually led to feeling excluded, but most people didn't necessarily say that they felt actively excluded, but what they said was they definitely felt like they weren't part of the club. And I thought, you know, that language was so important. Even though they weren't actively excluded, they still weren't included, right? And what I really found striking about this set of responses was, before I even got to the question, before I even asked any of them about their experiences of discrimination or racism, they started telling me without prompt that they had X, Y, and Z racist experience. And I thought that was really, really striking. I asked them about mentors, of course, and mentorship, and 71% of them said, yeah, they had a mentor. But most of the mentors that they talked about, and they, you know, they delved into their experiences with their mentors, most of their mentors weren't Black. And Some of them did have Black mentors, but the ones that did have Black mentors, those mentors weren't in communications or PR. So that means these women are now going beyond the field to try and find someone who's at a higher level to give them guidance, and then, you know, apply that knowledge or that experience and that guidance to public relations. And if I think about barriers, so I asked them all these questions, like what were the barriers that you experienced? Did you experience any barriers at all? Only 2 people said that they, at this point in their career, did not have any barriers. A lot of the other women said, yeah, there were barriers, definitely barriers to my career, but they weren't necessarily complete roadblocks. And I thought that was a really insightful point. Some of the barriers they talked about included being held back by managers. So 21% spoke about that, which I thought was actually kind of telling as well. Some cited racism, of course. Some cited motherhood. So really that gets back to the intersectionality piece, right? Some in general kind of spoke about intersectionality, just in general. When I asked them what were barriers, and some actually said intersectionality, big barrier for me. And then 12% of them cited racism and bias, and being held to, this idea of being held to kind of a higher standard, having this extra difficulty of wanting to be assertive and wanting to be able to say the things that they want to say, or really, you know, express their opinions, but always feeling the need to repress themselves because they didn't want to be seen as, you know, too angry, too Black, too bossy. 24% of them also talked about their natural hair as being a barrier for them, or at least that their natural hair and the way that they dressed were kind of a constant part of their daily thought process. And I asked participants about specifically the discrimination question at this point. And 43% of them said, yep, I've been discriminated against, no question. 26% of them said, not directly, but, you know, they had a feeling. 22% thought it was difficult to actually say 100% for sure. And 9% said, you know, I'm pretty sure I have a feeling, but I have no actual evidence and no proof. Which goes back to this concept that, of course, I read about in the research, which was this idea that it's subtle, it's ingrained, it's kind of hidden, but it's there. Almost, you know, all spoke about their organizational leaders being mostly white and therefore not having this comfortable space to talk about their race salient experiences. And if they can't talk about these experiences that they're having, they can't talk about these, you know, negative comments related to their hair or their sabotage they're feeling by colleagues and managers, then how can they possibly improve their environment? So I asked them how they responded to these incidents. What did they do? And they told me they either avoided the situation completely or ignored it because they had no recourse. They complied. So, you know, when they were hearing negative comments about their hair, they changed their hair. They changed the way they dressed to, I guess, fit in. And they talked about this idea that they just continue to increase their code switching, right? They continue to repress themselves in order to fit this mold that was created at the workplace. When I asked them about Black women in public relations, I asked them about whether or not they thought it was a diverse profession. 30% said, there's not a lot of Black women, but there's definitely more than there used to be in the profession. 26% flat out said, no, there are no Black women in the field, sorry. 26% said, if there are a lot of Black women in the field, I don't see them, I don't know where they are, I'm looking for them, I'm trying to reach out and I can't find them. And 19% spoke about this increase of students entering in PR. So, you know, there may not be enough or a lot at higher levels, but we're definitely seeing more young Black women entering the field in schools. When I asked them what could be deterring Black women, of course, 41% talked about this lack of representation, right? They said there are no role models, there are no Black leaders. Some talked about having no professors of color in schools and not seeing any, you know, guest speakers or anything like that lecturing or talking about it, and just generally not having the right network. 13% spoke about this idea of traditional backgrounds of their parents and their families, this idea that, you know, particularly immigrant families don't understand necessarily what public relations is, and therefore they don't value it, right? They don't value it as a field that they want their child to go into, so they're not encouraging them or pushing them to go into that field. And 10% cited a lack of awareness about public relations. And this is not going to surprise anyone here. I asked, is diversity important? Everyone said yes, resounding yes. And I asked them why. And they said, well, you know, diversity provided these different opinions, dynamic solutions, better discussions. And 27% talked about better storytelling, right? Better storytelling that will actually be able to connect with these diverse audiences that we are trying to connect to as communicators. So if I think about all the things I heard, what did I take away from the study? What did I take away from everything? When I step back and I think about it, you know, the answers weren't simple, but the answers were very clear. The reputation of public relations is narrow, right? It could be deterring Black women from entering because they don't see themselves represented. And they may not see it as a field for them to enter and a field where they can excel and succeed. We know gender and racial barriers still exist, and frankly, they're not as different from the barriers and experiences participants in old studies 30 years ago were talking about. But to me, you know, maybe there was some kind of hope that was uncovered in the research. Regardless of all of these negative experiences these women I spoke to talked about, nothing drove them from the field. And partly, you know, this could be because I will never really be able to speak to or kind of quantify the amount of Black women who were actually driven away from the field. There's no way I could find out, you know, there were 100,000 women that were once in public relations and they had a bad experience and then decided to quit and leave. So that's kind of seemingly impossible data to gather. But I did take some hope from it that despite everything that these women spoke about, they're still here, they're still pushing. And lastly, you know, diversity continues to be vital to the effectiveness and the credibility of public relations. And therefore, it is truly crucial that we encourage more people of all races, but particularly to this study, we encourage Black women to pursue careers in the practice. So all of this was done, as I said, in 2018. What does this mean for us now? How do we apply this now, and is this still relevant now? Let's think about how I started this talk, right? Let's think about what we first started talking about. Let's look at our socio-political climate currently, and let's narrow that once again and really think about what it means for a business, because we know communications is truly a vital business function. So we're seeing this widespread organizational response in this climate. We're seeing these leaders who really want to engage, who want to talk about anti-Black racism. They want to reinforce their beliefs and their values, both inside of their companies to their employees, and then of course to their clients externally. And we're seeing leaders who, they don't know what to say, right? They don't know how to say it. We're seeing that role fall to communicators, and that's not surprising to any of us. But where that becomes embarrassing is when the organization has very few or no Black communicators, or even like Black members of their leadership team, no one with a quote unquote seat at the table who can provide kind of an insider perspective. And then we have the organizations that do have maybe one or two Black voices. And someone mentioned this on Gail's talk last week as well, but those people now have a heavier burden, right? To educate everyone else. There's this expectation that this one or those few employees will all of a sudden make these broad standing decisions about how to appeal to you know, a Black community. This community, which within it carries so many varying different identities and experiences. So it really does become this huge burden. And it's just an added level of unfairness, quite frankly. So what can we do next? I had 3 recommendations that came out of my study, and I think they continue to be very, very relevant for today. The first one is that Black women really need to be disruptors in this field. And I myself, quite clearly, as you've seen, I'm also a Black female communicator, so I'm really talking to myself here when I say this. This requires a rewire for us. You know, we have to rewire our brains. As mentioned in the research I shared earlier, Black communicators often already live in this constant state of code switching, right? We live in a state where we're obviously always trying to manipulate ourselves to fit into this mold of whiteness, because that's how typically one has been able to succeed in this kind of white dominant environment. And now I'm proposing that, you know, we're at a place where we go against what we've learned to do. We instead find new opportunities to set ourselves apart. And we try and stand out, right? We try and be seen. And we try and be seen as ourselves, because the next generation of Black women that are entering the field, that are coming from schools, they need to see themselves and they need to see like their true selves in the field and succeeding. So we need to find more opportunities to mentor, to guide, to share experiences, and we need to help create networks and connections for those other Black women. But it's not only our responsibility, because there's, many of us have been doing this already and have been talking about this for so long, that PR associations and schools also must get involved. They have to be the sculptors. They have to be, responsible to reshape and rebuild this reputation of public relations. They got to be looking for opportunities to employ more diverse faculty, more diverse guest speakers, for example. They really have to be looking for ways to pursue practitioners of color, really trying to make it clear what the benefits and what the value of entering this industry and this practice are. And they should be reaching out to communities, like go to schools, go to other networks where diverse people frequent, and promote the value of the practice. And then lastly, organizations and organizational leaders, they have the biggest responsibility, in my opinion. They have to be nurturers, right? They have a responsibility to shape the environment in which PR operates. They have, this responsibility to create this open environment where people can openly talk about inclusion and racism and their experiences without being afraid. They really need to be kind of enforcing cultural sensitivity and unconscious bias training. And they have to go further than that though, right? I mean, they should be learning about the true history of anti-Black racism. They have to learn about cultural cues within the Black community. And if you really think about it, Black Canadians have had to learn about kind of mainstream culture and mainstream cultural cues inherently all the time just to survive and succeed in it. So, I really think everyone should be making an effort to learn about Black culture and frankly, other cultures as well. Organizations really need to think about, where and how they're getting candidates for positions. They need to look critically at the composition of their teams. They need to really question whether there are more opportunities for outreach and where they can do different types of outreach. And the biggest part here, I think, is they need to talk openly about the problems, the social issues happening around us. I mean, for years, these things have been happening in the news, these incidents have been happening, and they've been impacting Black employees, for example. And, no one is talking about it. No one wants to acknowledge that they exist and that they're race related. So, there really needs to be more than just a verbal commitment about supporting the Black community and about being anti-racist. Actions speak much, much louder than words. And I truly think that if we do all of these things, and when I say we, I mean we as a community of communicators, even having conversations like the ones that we're having now, the ones that we're going to have over the next few weeks, I really think communications as a profession will be in a much, 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 much better place. And there we are. That's it. Those are my thoughts.
Wow.
Sorry, I think that was long. I tried to get
No, that was not long at all. No, I think everybody's doing a collective wow. And thank you. And thank you for just the wonderful way you have weaved this narrative through the research that you've done. I am equally as proud today as I was in that moment when you presented to defend your capstone. And I'm equally amazed and awestruck by how relevant it is today.
So relevant.
Right? So this notion that, champions and warriors and advocates sometimes have to be out there alone in the middle of the street without anybody there recognizing you for the insights that you have. And people think you're crazy, right? Like you're just standing out there, but you are you're the leading edge of this. And Gail's presentation last week also set the stage. And, I'm just so excited for this series because I think we are having moments of awakening. At the same time, I don't want to be so naive to think that 8 presentations on diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to change the world, but I hope it allows it to be conversation starters and openers. So thank you.
And maybe it will change one person, right? Like even if it changes one person or the actions of one person, maybe that person will do something that will impact someone else.
Yeah. So let me just go back to this, to the conversation that's been happening on the chat.
Yeah, I saw a million little stars, and I was wondering if I should pop it on them, but
No, you don't. I'll navigate it for us here. Marissa King said, did anyone you spoke to make a connection between mentorship and allyship?
No, but that would be a very interesting study.
Yeah.
Personally, I think so.
Yeah, and again, I think there's so much more that we can do as a community of practitioners and scholars and supporters within the MCM program. But I think we can also do it beyond this walls. And I think we can define this notion that, you have many allies here, people that want to help and open the doors and knock down the doors with you,
Right.
who might not look like you either, who might not be the same gender as you, but who want to help. And I think, I think professional associations have to do a lot more about this, but I think these activists and champions and warriors, as I'm calling you, and need to also step up to the plate. Right. So I think you have to put your hand up and say, I want to run for the board of CPRS. I want to be involved in governance of these professional societies. Chuck is on the board of IPR, and it was one that, I had to talk to him about this, about, if we want change and we want visible change, then we have to have people that are ready to put it up. And there's costs, right? There's cost to it. And it might not be fair or equitable cost, but sometimes you have to be able to sort of step up to the plate and make that comment as well. And I think, again, time is everything, right? So allyship, I think you have lots of allies here and friends that are going to open doors as well. So Tammy just said, Tammy Quigley said, you've motivated me as a leader to add this to the agenda on my next staff meeting tomorrow. Thank you.
Good.
Philip just said, yes, I want to echo the wow, a clarion call to all of us in the profession in the academy, plus some very doable actionable approaches as well. Yeah, and we're going to promote this like we did with Gales as well, and get that out. And we'll take this, we'll create the wind behind your sail to help you out there. And also sort of a prescient time to start a new business, Shar.
I know, but as we talked about, I needed a new opportunity, so I made one for myself, period.
What the hell? Like, this is perfect. This is perfect. Sarah Goldvine says, love the recommendations around being disruptors. Would like to hear your thoughts on how those of us with race privilege can support. Being a disruptor is powerful and it comes with risks. What can leaders do to create the space safety for Black women to be disruptors?
That's a good question. I mean, I'd say two big things. The first thing is create space like this, right? Terry, you're giving us a space. You're giving me a space to be a disruptor. You're giving me a platform to be able to stand up and say what I need to say. And frankly, to say it, with no kind of shyness, right? I don't think there are necessarily a lot of opportunities where you'd have someone like me who could come out and say, race is a problem. Listen to what I'm saying, race is a problem. And to say it as directly as this, because as I said, there really is this rewiring we have to do now to be able to say, I don't need to be afraid to say this is an issue, and I don't need to be afraid to say it as clearly as I'm saying it now. So, give us essentially this opportunity or a platform, if you have it, to be able to say things openly, right? And the second piece of that, I would say, really follows along the same line. Like if you're holding a talk, or if you're a leader of an organization, bring in these faces, right? Bring in as many faces as you can find. Because like I said, when I was going through PR school, and I don't mean MCM, I mean 12 years ago when I was in PR school, I didn't have a Black professor to tell me what it would be like for me, or to tell me kind of how to navigate this. I did not have any Black mentors that were in the field that I could look up to or talk to. So help make connections, I'd say. I think that's a really big and a really important part as well. Help make connections if you can.
Your wonderful OPS friend and colleague Stephanie asks a question. I know you're busy with your little one, but I think this presentation would be an excellent learning tool for organizations. Have you considered using this research as training for leadership in various organizations?
Oh gosh, I have not thought about it, but that's a really interesting point, actually. I mean, I think there's definitely an opportunity to train or to share this information more widespread in a way that can help organizations, or, you know, I think that's a good question. I think that's a good question. I think if organizations are open to it, it should definitely be done. I don't know if I'm the person to do it, but I could try.
Stop that. Yes, you will be doing it. Yes, just do it and charge for it.
And charge for it. Well,
and
that's
charge for it, right? Do not. Yeah, I mean we have a lot of great research. You've done a lot of great research. We have a goal of disseminating and sharing and motivating and making that change. But white people in this situation might say, yeah, sure, I'll happy to do it. It's like $3,000 a day.
Right.
So I think you don't be afraid that you have knowledge and insights and experiences that the organizations will also pay for it, right? So we all have to make a living. And
it's the rewiring. See, right now I'm rewiring still.
Yeah. Rob Esselman asked, I'm curious about Char's experience in government and whether they are doing anything different than what she has learned about the other years.
Nope.
I didn't even
not doing anything different. I will tell you quite openly that it's been a discussion, and not just in communication, just widespread in government, that there are not enough Black leadership or just, you know, diversity, that there are issues with management and sabotage and issues with race relations. And not only I mean, I worked in Ontario government, but in the federal government, and I know this from my other networks and colleagues and so on who've said this as well. And there are already disruptors. Like, there are already people who are doing way more than I am to say, hey, hello, this is an issue. And we have, you know, the former Secretary of Cabinet actually came out and was like, I realize there's a problem. I swear I'm going to do something about this. But of course, talking about transformation and making transformation happen are two different things. Did we see transformation? I'm going to tell you no. Did they talk about transformation? Sorry. Yes, they did. So yeah, I think this is something, or this is an area that government could learn from as well, not just the private sector.
Maybe that's the answer. They got it confused with the word transportation and started talking about that, and then just did that. Like, right? But I think you're right. I think these are, you know, we're at the starting point of a long journey,
right?
If that makes sense. This journey has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you know, we have. I think timing in life is always critical, and I think there's important timing to take advantage of. And anything that we can do in this program that helps you and your colleagues and our colleagues make these disruptive changes, I think we're all behind that. And you know, when you put yourself out there, be ready to be taken up on. And I think, you know, part of that warrior champion advocate mentality is that it's going to be exhausting, right? Disrupting and change and advocacy is an exhausting, lifelong business. And you know, people will take advantage of that for whatever checkbox reasons they have. Others will do it because they really want to help make change. And we all have to rise to the occasion. So I want to thank you for doing this. I want to thank Gail and you and Chuck and Sarah and Parm and all those that are stepping up to the table to help us share this. I'm looking forward to Chuck's presentation. Chuck, the bar has been raised, brother. The bar has been.
It has. Sorry, you did a phenomenal job. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And we look forward, you know, to a same but different perspective, you know, one that isn't that intersection of race and gender as well, but with the, you know, the other part of that street is mostly from an American perspective. And so, Chuck, I look forward to having your presentation. Maybe before we start, Chuck, next week, you can also give us what it's like to be on the front line of healthcare in North Carolina next week. I know that things might be crazy by then. We're seeing that, but that would help us just have a better personal sense of what it's like to be a communicator on the front lines.
Sure, I can do that.
That's great. Thank you, one and all. We're going to do some pretty quick edits. So, Shar, you'll get an email from Devin with the video, and we'd like to get this up right away, and we want to promote the heck out of it. So, all the best, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Ciao.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.